Welcome to the Astounding Convergence of Physics and Metaphysics. My name is Marc Newkirk. It's a great joy for me to share this information with you here today. It's been very much of a personal journey in observing this phenomenon where physics and metaphysics, which historically have been on opposite poles of consciousness and premises, are actually merging, not because metaphysics is moving toward physics, but because the leading edge discovery in physics is bringing the understanding of physics closer and closer into alignment, actually, with what has been known historically for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years and more, in metaphysics. So it's an exciting time, very exciting time on the planet. I spent my entire career basically on the leading edge of science and technology and discovery, and I have witnessed firsthand this movement between the classical physics in the direction of totally different understanding, which is actually convergent with the understandings of metaphysics, which have historically arisen by inner knowing. Classical physics does not accept the entire premise of inner knowing, just spontaneously knowing information, but the leading edge of scientific discovery is, in fact, showing that those things are valid and real. The reason for this lecture has been my awareness of a widening information gap between what is known generally by the public and by our higher educational institutions and taught by our higher educational institutions across the planet, and what is known at the leading edge of scientific discovery, which increasingly is experiencing a greater and greater gulf between what we know at the leading edge of scientific discovery and what's being taught still by every higher educational institution on the planet as though it was a fact. And many of the things that are taught as facts, many of the things, thank you very much, many of the things which are known to be facts by the public are not. They're actually, as we understand it now, based upon what's been discovered and proven in the scientific community, they're not true. And yet you have all kinds of knowledge out there in the public thinking that, the scientific community's proven these things, which we've been taught, and we all know they're true. And in fact, they're not. There are many things that aren't. And what I'll be doing is going through a series of pieces of scientific evidence which are proven by credible researchers beyond a shadow of a doubt at this point, and these aren't just fringe operators. These are people from mainstream scientific institutions that are household names across the planet. But as I say, the public isn't really hearing much about a lot of this. They catch glimpses of pieces of it, but a lot of it really isn't known yet widely. So the purpose, my purpose, is to share some of this information, including its pedigree and sources, and then talk about what actually this all means when it comes to understanding the physics of it. And please don't be put off by the word physics. I promise you that I will be covering this at a level that you don't need a PhD in physics to understand it. I'm really talking about fundamentally how everything works. I mean, this is that fundamental. And it's, as I indicated earlier, it's a very personal journey for me in that many of the people who've made these discoveries are known to me personally. Some of them I've worked with for years. So I'm really quite aware of the information that I'm sharing with you here today. the reasons for the gap existing between what's known by the public and still being taught across the board, nearly, by higher educational institutions, and what is known and proven at the leading edge of science and technology varies, but there are four fundamental excuses, if you will, that would tend to account for why this is the case. The first is that we're living in an absolutely amazing time in modern history where the pace of scientific discovery is running right off the charts. There's a very high rate of scientific discovery, and it's almost impossible to keep up with it. One of my dearest friends, who was the founder of the Materials Research Lab at Penn State and was a preeminent scientist around the world, used to like to stand up at scientific conferences and when he'd make presentations, and he'd say, read the literature. You got to read the literature, because many people were reporting on things where they hadn't really even read all of the literature that pertained to the latest discoveries. But the truth is, today, it's impossible to read all the literature. There's so much of it, you couldn't possibly read it all. In all deference to my dear friend, it's gotten to the point where there's more than you could actually get by just reading all the literature. You'd never get anything else done, and you still wouldn't read it all. A second culprit that has caused the existence of this gap is a so-called peer review process. The mainstream media are reluctant to put out things which don't supposedly come from real pedigree in the mainstream scientific community, and there are a number of major institutions where you publish your information in different disciplines that tend to preside over what gets published and what doesn't get published in the scientific literature, at least the mainstream scientific literature. There's always fringe scientific literature, but for example, the American Chemical Society, the American Physical Society, and various various major medical publications and things. They watch very closely what they publish, and they put it through typically what's called a peer review process, where supposedly peers that are of equal caliber and knowledge in your field that you're publishing in will actually review what you've submitted to the literature and approve it before it gets published. And the idea is to sort out bad science and not publish that stuff, at least by any of the more credible institutions, and also to sort out fraud. Those are laudable. But the nature of the peer review process lends itself to abuse, and in part because most of the peer review processes have historically been blind. That is, they take your thing that you've submitted to get published and they put it out to your, quote, peers, who can sit there and go thumbs down on it, and they don't really have to explain it to you. They don't really have to explain it to anybody. They may, but they may not. Anyway, what happens as a result of that is that in the scientific community, if you do good work, and your work is incremental, it tends to get published, incremental improvements. But if you do anything that's revolutionary, that stuff is really hard to get through because of a combination of things. One, egos, people feeling, oh, well, I know the truth and this isn't it, and they don't even bother to investigate, which is actually not appropriate. Or secondly, people who don't want it to get published, because actually if that's true, then maybe everything that they published in their career, for which they now have the MIT chair and whatever, or various recognitions, turns out to be false. And the highest quality of them really just care about truth. But there are quite a few people for which that unfortunately isn't true. And so there are some who will turn thumbs down on something because it's threatening to them, or it threatens their funding on their work, and has a very real impact on the people that are working for them and themselves and everything else. So, and sometimes it's a matter of jealousy in addition. So the peer review process, as I say, basically admits incrementalism, but it rarely admits revolutionary things. And the way that revolutionary things get into the literature is by revolutions where eventually the public at large becomes aware that this is true, and because there are so many of the examples of it in the public, and as a matter of credibility, they finally have to allow this stuff. There's also a public information glut. You can go on the internet and you can find anything almost that you can imagine being said by somebody, and the question is, what's true? Finally, there are many people whom, when they hear pieces of the truth, they feel very threatened with regard to their fundamental belief systems, because if this is true over there, then this thing that they've known all their lives and taught their children and rely on may not be true. But if it's only a piece of the picture, it hasn't left them with anything to move to. It's just shot a hole in their boat, and they're sinking, and they don't want to hear it, So all of those are the reasons for the gap. This isn't a new problem, incidentally. Max Planck, who is considered the father of quantum physics, once remarked essentially that science advances one funeral at a time. That you kind of have to wait for the old guard to die off before you can really get acceptance. And there's some truth to that. Maybe it's not entirely true, but there's a lot of it, and that's certainly what he encountered when he was coming up with the beginnings of quantum physics, which increasingly has been accepted as fact. This presentation is actually divided into 4 segments, and the first 3 are all about evidence. They're all examples of things which have been proven, in my view, beyond any reasonable doubt, and by many people at the leading edge of science, they know this to be fact, but there's a commonality to every example that I'll give you, in that every example that I'll give you today in those 3 segments violates the classical physics as what's possible. So the bottom line is the classical physics is wrong. And at leading edge physics, they're increasingly understanding that the way everything works is completely different than people think it is. As an example of the kind of thing that has been taught and accepted by the masses as though it's been proven, you have the so-called Big Bang Theory. Almost every school child can recite for you the Big Bang Theory. And many people think, oh, well, that's been proven. We know the Big Bang Theory. Well, there was some rather skimpy evidence that formed the basis of the Big Bang Theory when it was theorized. But since that time in astrophysics, there have been a lot of discoveries now that prove that whatever happened, it wasn't the Big Bang Theory. And yet you have people walking around thinking, oh yeah, this is how it all started. It all started with the Big Bang and all this stuff is true. It isn't. It's not. It's known, as I say, it's certainly known that that wasn't true. And then the question is, well, what is? And another common example would be Darwinian evolution. I mean, still taught in the schools, and again, most of the population thinks, oh, well, we know that Darwinian evolution occurs, survival of the fittest, and blah, 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 and you get genetic mutations, and that's how we got here. We came from monkeys and, all of this kind of stuff. Well, in fact, Darwinian evolution also ran into many issues that are now known, and the archaeological record, for example, does not support Darwinian evolution when you look at, well, there's this gradual change over time and all of this mutated into this. What it actually supports is long periods of stability punctuated by short periods of very rapid change where entire systems go out and new ones come in like overnight. The dinosaurs being a good example of that. But there are many other examples as well that you can see in the archaeological record when you dig down and you look at what was going on. And so people start scratching their heads and saying, well, what happened that caused suddenly everything to change, thus and such to disappear, and these things came in overnight? And that's actually even happening right now. Like people think that well, people are commonly aware that there are a lot of species disappearing off the planet, and they think, oh, man's been a bad boy and that's causing all this. Well, man has been a bad boy and it may well be causing some of it. But what you don't tend to hear about is that in the Mekong Delta, there are more than 150 new species that have been discovered there that weren't here before in just the last 10, 15 years. That in Papua New Guinea, there are over 200 new species have been discovered that weren't here before. What's happening? You know, it's not just that we're endangering the planet. We are. You know, I don't mean to relieve anybody of that impression that man has become in conflict with the planet, but it's more complicated than that. And actually, what causes evolution is not what people think. Okay, so we'll continue. I have to say, anomalies and phenomena I just love. My whole career has been about anomalies and phenomena. I've been an innovator and led a lot of innovation over my career in leading edge science and technology. I built a company that at one point had 3,500 patents in its field. I've been personally a very prolific inventor with more than 100 US patents that I'm inventor or co-inventor of, and more than 900 foreign counterparts. Almost all of those that I was just mentioning are based upon behavioral phenomena, discoveries of phenomena where something happened that isn't supposed to be possible, and instead of covering it up and sweeping it under the rug, you know, we looked at, well, what does this mean? And what can you do with that if that turns out to be true? And these phenomena were true, and we parlayed them into new materials, new products, new technologies, new capabilities, and everything from satellite components to the state-of-the-art ballistic armor to components for computers and power generation, the power generation industry, and wear parts for the mining industry, and flow control elements for molten steel that were way better, and higher performance sports equipment, and parts that went into the first electric cars and hybrids and stuff. You know, all kinds of different applications that came out of phenomena. So I love phenomena. I love them because they lead to new truths. And those new truths represent typically opportunities for nonlinear progress. Instead of just progressing like this, all of a sudden you go, wow, I'm way up here. Wow, I'm way up here. And nonlinear progress of the civilization as a whole, scientifically, generally involves phenomena. So everything I'll be talking about today is proof of phenomena, actually, that break the rules. Well, classically, science teaches these 5 basic precepts. That, first of all, classical science teaches that reality is what we can sense or measure. Well, what we can sense and measure is a moving target. I mean, nowadays we have instruments that can measure higher and higher frequencies. I mean, nobody in Max Planck's day, for example, had detectors that could detect, way up in the gigahertz range, and let alone have systems that operated there, or detect, in fact, the human aura. There's a field that surrounds all living beings, which mainstream science for years said, oh no, that's just nonsense. We can't measure it, we don't see it, and it's not true, even though there was a percentage of the population that could see it and knew darn well there was something going on there, but they were very much the minority. The second precept, which is pretty much universal within classical science, has been that all causality is generated by 5 fields. Well, a field is something that creates an influence at a distance from the source. So examples of the 5 fields, and the only 5 fields accepted by classical physics, are gravitational fields, electric fields, where you have an electric charge and it can influence something at a distance, magnetic fields, which can influence something at a distance, and strong and weak nuclear attraction fields. Those, the latter, have to do with, strong nuclear attraction fields are what causes the nucleus of an atom to hold together, for example. And as we know, when you break those bonds, you get a lot of energy, namely nuclear explosion. Weak attraction fields, nuclear fields are what holds the electrons, in orbit around an atom's nucleus, and we know we can remove electrons or add electrons in some cases, and those, are sustained in their orbit by these weak or strong fields. But those 5 fields are basically viewed to cause everything. That everything evolved from that, from matter to energy to the cosmos and planets, and all of that stuff is all expressed in those terms. There's a third precept, which is that mankind and the world are random products of chaos, and that's been a widely held view of classical science. A widely held view also, which has basically been taught and schooled over long periods, are that we are our bodies. This is us. That's it. We're a product of chemistry and coincidence and nothing more. And a fifth precept is that nothing is either eternal, nothing lasts forever, nothing's eternal, and nothing is spiritual. There's no such thing as spiritual. There's just what we can see and sense and measure physically. On the leading edge of science, there's a growing volume of scientific evidence from credible scientists and credible institutions, world-class leading institutions, that clearly demonstrates that none of those precepts are correct, not one of them. In fact, the evidence shows that we are way more amazing than we realize, and that life is much more exciting and hopeful than people have come to believe and been taught. Well, I'm going to now move to some of the evidence. The approach which I'll take will be to describe who did the work, what their backgrounds were, what institutions they came from, and then what the work is. And as you'll see as we go through the examples, all of the work that I'll describe in the first 3 segments of this, of these 4 parts, will be things that have been proven that violate the classical physics. The 4th segment will in fact talk about, okay, if those things are true, what do they mean? How are they possible? And how does everything work? And that'll be the 4th segment. That'll be a segment which talks about physics, but talks about the way physics really is, as opposed to what people have been taught in classical physics. Okay, the first guy I'd like to introduce you to is Hal Putoff. Putoff got his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Florida. He then joined the U.S. Navy, and he was assigned to the National Security Agency. NSA is the one that handles all our spy satellites, and frequently is viewed to be infringing our privacy in the interest of national security, supposedly. and I'm sure some of it is. I'm sure a lot of it is. It's very hard, I'm sure, for them to operate on the fringe, and when you've got terrorists supposedly, all among us and all this kind of thing. So it's become a rather controversial undertaking. But Putoff was with the NSA back in the early days when all the surveillance and stuff was really starting to gel and be put in place, and using more and more technology. He then went to the microwave lab at Stanford University in the early days of microwaves, where that whole area in communications and other forms, popularly, we're all aware of the microwave oven. But microwaves today have enormous place in our communication systems. He then went to a spin-off of Stanford called Stanford Research International, which later was called SRI, and was working in laser physics back in the early days of lasers and their emergence. He subsequently became head of the remote viewing program, which I'll talk about in a minute. And today he's the director for the Institute of Advanced Studies in Austin, Texas. The work which I'll be describing of his was jointly done with Russel Targ, who got his BS in physics from Queens College, did grad work in laser physics in Columbia University, then actually joined Stanford and was co-founder of the Stanford Research Institute, which today is world famous for its leading edge studies and technological prowess. He subsequently became a senior staff scientist for Lockheed Missiles in Space, and has published extensively in the IEEE, which is the largest professional organization in the world, and also both the publications put out by Science in Nature, which is one of the two most prestigious organizations, and the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, puts out a publication called Science. So it's hard to get stuff in those kind of publications, but this guy has the credibility and the experience. He's also the author of 9 books. Well, the technology that I want to talk to you about there, the discovery and technology and proof of a whole different area of science, is what's called remote viewing. And some of you may have heard of remote viewing. Remote viewing was developed at SRI International by these two laser physicists, Putoff and Targ, working with a small group of psychics, one of the most notable being a guy named Ingo Swann, who was quite a phenomenal psychic, no longer with us today, but Ingo could walk down the street, and street in New York where he lived, and he would be in tears by the end of the block because he could read what was going on with everybody. And actually, when he and Pat Price and other psychics were working with Putoff and Targ on the development of the protocols which became known as remote viewing, it was done on CIA contract, a very small CIA contract originally. And some of the senators in the oversight committee that came to look at what they were doing refused to meet with Ingo Swann because they didn't want him knowing everything that they knew. So they wouldn't even allow him in the room when they came to meet and review what was going on in this whole thing. But anyway, Ingo had the idea, which he convinced Putoff and Targ ought to be investigated, that everybody had psychic abilities, but they were suppressed in most people. And so they decided to bring in a couple other psychics as well, several other psychics as well, a small team, I think maybe 5 or so, and work on developing protocols which you could use to elicit these abilities from people where it had been suppressed. And in the words of one of the developers, they ended up developing protocols where you could take someone with a psychic ability to bag of hammers, quote unquote, and teach them to transcend time and space. And they did, in fact, do that. As I say, some of the public has heard of this. Most of the public doesn't really know a whole lot about this, even though it became the subject in the mid-90s. As I say, it was developed in the 1970s, early 70s. In the mid-1990s, it became the subject of public congressional testimony by the CIA, who confirmed that, in fact, not only did it exist, but there were 20 years of classified military programs, highly classified military programs, that 4 of them, I believe, that used those protocols to gather military intelligence in situations where they couldn't possibly have gathered it any other way. And it was very successful. And what these protocols did was teach people to access information from within themselves. And they subsequently in the research, they proved that this could be done on any subject by anybody, independent of space and time, independent of separation, independent of electromagnetic shielding. They put them in Faraday cages and grounded them. So some of the techniques they used to attempt to understand this phenomenon proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that there wasn't any physics that could possibly explain it. Because if it wasn't electromagnetic, which, classically people are taught that, thoughts are just an electrochemical brain phenomenon, and, we can detect those with a electroencephalograph, and, that's all thought is. These people were gathering information mentally through a Faraday cage, which would clearly ground out anything in the way of electromagnetic anything. And moreover, this phenomenon was independent of distance. It didn't matter whether the target that they were asked to develop information about was, in the next room or under the sea, which classically would be viewed to be impossible to communicate with via some kind of any kind of electromagnetic anything, or even acoustics, would damp out over distance. It didn't matter whether they were in space, which they tested. It didn't matter whether they were under the sea. It didn't matter whether they were in Russia or anything else. So there was a phenomenon here. Basically, what these people were doing was accessing information on literally any subject from within. And one of the implications of this was that they're really at the highest level of capability. There's no such thing as a secret. And that, of course, was potential dynamite when it came to the Cold War and governments trying to seek an edge over each other. So, as I say, it ended up being used by both the CIA and Central Intelligence Agency and also the Defense Intelligence Agency in the military over a period of 20 years before they admitted that there was any such thing going on. And after they admitted that such a thing was going on and it was public information that this in fact existed, some of those people that used to be in those programs proceeded to teach this publicly. To people, and it's been publicly taught now for nearly 20 years. Actually, I was taught by one of the people that came out of the military remote viewing programs, and my wife was taught by them, my kids were taught by them, and the last time I checked with them, which was probably 10 years ago now, he taught more than 13,000 people to remote view. And there were others from the programs who taught remote viewers as well. Well, the original technology which they developed, the original set of protocols were something called coordinate remote viewing. And basically what they would do is they would choose a target. And a target could be, any person, place, or thing, or a technology, or an event, or anything they wanted. And they could either just write it down on a piece of paper what the target was, or more often they would take a picture of it if it was a place or a thing or something like that. And when they were training people, they would choose these targets. The person who chose the target would then give it to somebody else who had no idea. They'd put it in an envelope, seal it, give it to somebody else who had no idea consciously what the target was, and that person would assign what ultimately became an 8-digit computer-generated random code to it, and they'd write that on the outside of the envelope. And then neither the photograph nor the written description or whatever it was that defined the target, nor the envelope was given to the remote viewer. The remote viewer was just given that 8-digit code. Here's an 8-digit code. Now use these protocols to go within yourself and tell us whatever your impressions are about the code. Well, that's pretty blind. That's called double blind. And the people that were originally starting out training, like when I was being trained, in even a weekend, the 30 people or so that were in my class, by the end of the class, they were starting to get, almost all of the class were starting to get a certain amount of information that apparently came from the targets, quite amazingly, when you followed these protocols. And that's kind of life-changing when that's the case, I can tell you. So anyway, the viewer would use these protocols to elicit information about the target. Then the results were judged independently by somebody else. And in the military programs, there were a group of judges who would judge them after the remote viewer came up with the results. And the way that they would judge them initially in the training programs was they had the target. So they'd look at the target and see, well, did this apparently come from the target? And if you had a group of judges that all said yeah, or most of them, majority of them said yeah, then they went back to the remote viewer. They showed him this information and they said, look, you actually appear to have gotten information. And what they found was, as the person would start to accept the idea that they could really do this, they would open their aperture farther and they'd get better at it. So they could literally train them to do this. The best remote viewers got as much as about 80% of the information right that they would receive. But there were a lot of remote viewers that never got above 50% that were even, even did it for a living for the military. And the reason this was useful was in the intelligence gathering community, they would use the same techniques that they used on signal processing. Like if you were getting a radio signal and it was weak and there was a lot of static, what the military had developed a long time ago was the approach of taking like 5 antennas and spacing them out over a distance and then receiving the information. And then they would compare the information from the 5 antennas. And if they got the same information from several antennas, like say 3 out of 5 or something like that, they assumed that was the signal and they threw the rest of it out. And that was a very good way of getting information and confirming that it was true. And they did the same thing with the remote viewers. They might, on a double-blind basis, assign a target to the remote viewers. Well, in military intelligence, they didn't know what the target information was. That's what they were trying to find out. But they could use a group of judges to look for commonalities, and if they got the same information from 3, 4, 5 remote viewers that was very specific, they would assume that information was correct, and it would be. And so that's how it was used. There were 3 key principles that were involved with remote viewing. One was they teach you record all data, whether you write it down or there's a tape recorder and you're just expressing what you're getting or whatever. Record all data and impressions being received, no matter how ridiculous it might seem, just put it down. And because usually they were getting pieces of things that the problem was that if you would analyze, if the remote viewer would start to analyze the information when they got it, inevitably they'd distort it. So another thing they taught them is never analyze it when you're receiving it. Don't worry about what it is. Don't worry about how ridiculous it sounds. Just put it down. And the way it would be analyzed is by somebody else who wasn't in the process of receiving. because what would happen inevitably is if they analyzed it as they were getting it and they didn't, which is human nature, your ego and curiosity, want to know and you hope you're right and all this. If you analyze it when you get it, then you get this little thing and you get this little bit of information and you say, yeah, it's like, it's sort of bushy and it's a feather duster. And well, it actually is the tail of an elephant, you just missed the trunk and the big ears and the rest of it, It has nothing to do with the feather duster, So anyway, you had to not care about the results, divorce yourself from caring about the results, because otherwise you would block. Your ego would get in the way because it would be afraid of being wrong, And so you had to get in training to the point where you didn't care how ridiculous it was, you didn't care whether it was right or wrong, you just put it down. And, after you trained in all these ways, you would get to be actually quite good at it typically. Just as a final aspect, just to give you an idea in the military and intelligence community, examples of what they did before they made it known to the Congress and the public that this was real. There was a Russian bomber that crashed in Africa, and of course we have all kinds of intelligence satellites and all that kind of thing. They do too, and the whole intelligence community and connections, they couldn't find it. The Russians obviously wanted to know where it was. We wanted to know where it was too, of course. We meaning the United States, and I wasn't part of those programs. They couldn't find it anywhere. So they tasked the remote viewers with finding it. And sure enough, the remote viewers were able to tell them where it was. And then they were able to focus the satellite down on that area and then subsequently confirm, yeah, that's where it was. So they found it that way. They described a number of Soviet weapons factories in Siberia that they had no access to, where they were, what they did, what kind of weapons they had. You may recall there was a NATO general by the name of James Dozier, who was the deputy chief of staff of the NATO ground forces in Southern Europe. And he was kidnapped by the Red Brigade in Italy, and it was in all the papers and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately the Italian police found him and freed him. Well, the way that they found him was the remote viewers. The U.S. remote viewers actually were able to tell him where he was, who took him, what the conditions were, whether they could continue to negotiate or whether they needed to break in because they were going to kill him, or what the situation was. And this situation was used in hostage recovery and things like that a number of times by the government. And that was an example. Another example, which was described to me by my teacher, David Morehouse, when he was in the program. They, at one point, were tasked by the intelligence community to find out, they knew that there was a factory that had been, or some kind of a building, I should say, that had been built in the former Soviet Union. This was before the dissolution of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They knew that this was a highly secure facility. They couldn't get any agents in. They couldn't get any information about it, but it was obviously a very significant project just by virtue of the amount of secrecy that was going on with it. And so they tasked the remote viewers to find out what's going on in this building. And the remote viewers came back, and they after the analysis of commonalities and everything, it came back and said they're building a new submarine. And these are the kind of drives that the submarine uses. They're very quiet drives. These are what the armaments are and all that. Very specific. And the intelligence community said, that can't be right, because, yeah, as it turns out, this facility is very close to the water, but it's not on the water, so it can't be a submarine. And so they tasked him to go get more information. They came back and they said, well, on thus and such a day in May, they will blast a channel from that building to the water and they'll launch it that way. And that's exactly what happened. And those were the first Soviet Typhoon-class submarines, and that's how the United States government found out about, the Typhoon-class submarines, was via remote viewing. The U.S., of course, is not the only one to be using this kind of technology. It's not the only country, but it obviously was an important thing. Also, you may recall, some of you may recall the Patty Hearst abduction, and actually the way that the kidnapper was found by name, and his car was identified specifically in the way that police arrested him, was via the remote viewing group. They, in fact, found out that information, and that's how Patty Hearst was, in fact, recovered. Russel Targ said that he was actually in the police station when they recovered her, and they'd given him that information. So anyway, that kind of capability is really, at odds with any kind of classical view of what we are. There's no way in classical physics that you could possibly access information across space and time. Just go within yourself and come back with that kind of information if you're just a piece of meat walking around that is just physical. And brainwaves don't account for it. There's no physics that accounts for how you could possibly do this across space and time. I mean, some of these events they also were able to talk about things that would happen in the future, or things that happened in the past that weren't even necessarily the same time frame. So anyway, it was a complete paradigm buster. And it's been known publicly since some of these guys, first of all, the CIA testimony in the mid-90s, and then some of these guys wrote books about it and everything, but mostly ignored by the press, even though this is probably one of the most amazing pieces of technical and scientific information that has ever been had on something that implies something about the nature of us. And in fact, it's a brick in the wall of evidence now, and you'll see others as we go, that actually we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and we actually our highest awareness is omniscient. Well, that's quite an amazing thing when you realize that you have within yourself a direct access to omniscience, and that your highest level of awareness, we all have multiple levels of awareness, but your highest level of awareness is literally omniscient. The reason, incidentally, why your highest level of awareness is omniscient is that at that level, there's only one awareness, and it's the awareness of all things, and of course it knows everything, but you are part of that. Okay, the second example I wanted to give you, which was interesting about what it implied for our nature as people, as individuals, as human beings, is work that was done by Ian Stevenson, and then later Jim Tucker joined him, both of the University of Virginia ultimately. Stevenson had a very illustrious career. He was educated and became an MD. Had a Bachelor of Science, became an MD, came from McGill University in Toronto, Canada. He did residencies in various hospitals in Montreal, Phoenix, New Orleans, Tulane School of Medicine, etc., Cornell Medical College. He was a fellow at several of those colleges, became an associate professor of psychiatry at Louisiana School of Medicine, Louisiana State. And was a graduate of the Washington Psychoanalytical Institute. He, later on in his career, mid-career, became professor and chairman of the Department of Psychiatry of the University of Virginia. So this guy was preeminent in his field, and he ended up being the author of approximately 300 scientific papers and 14 books. This guy was very well thought of within his field. He was one of the leaders in this field. A guy that I met personally, I first heard about Stevenson's work right after he'd passed on, so I never met Stevenson, but I have met Jim Tucker and spent time talking with Jim Tucker. He was an associate at Stevenson that worked on a number of these projects with him, and he came from University of North Carolina School of Medicine, and got his MD and Bachelor in Psychology, and did postgrad work at the University of Virginia Health System, and began to distinguish himself in that system. Became finally director of the Division of Perceptual Studies following Stevenson's passing of the University of Virginia Health System. He's, at the time that I knew him, he'd authored about 25 papers and 2 books, and he's made dozens and dozens of presentations on phenomena such as past life-related phenomena. Well, Stevenson and Tucker did some very good scientific work on the subject of reincarnation. Neither of them historically believed in reincarnation. And originally Stevenson was approached by somebody from the University of North Carolina who wanted him to look at a child. He was doing a lot of child psychology. I wanted to look at him to look at a case of a child that they'd run across that, in fact, between the ages of 3 and 5, was starting to talk about prior experiences in a prior life, and that wasn't so unusual, except that in this case, this child was giving a lot of very specific information that when Stevenson finally agreed to look at the case, he was really struck by the fact that the kind of information this child was giving was possible to be investigated. I mean, you could find out whether there was somebody that had that name, that lived in that town in that time, and had siblings of thus and such a name, and died in that way, and stuff. I mean, you could investigate that. So he began to investigate, and he found that, in fact, there was evidence, quite a bit of evidence, that there had been somebody in the past that had predated this child that had those characteristics. And it was interesting. And then he began to look around and find that there were actually a lot of other cases like that around the world. And he proceeded to spend decades chasing down these cases and investigating these cases. And he ended up studying and publishing 2,500 cases of small children that were doing this kind of thing, ages 2 to 5 typically. Usually by the time they were 5 years old, they not only stopped talking about these things, they typically forgot that they ever said them, even though their parents and siblings knew about it, but usually they became completely unaware that they'd ever said these things. And in these 2,500 cases, about half of these cases he was able to corroborate with compelling evidence that, in fact, there were people who predated them that they were describing that had those characteristics, and those were compelling. And so he published them. It was obvious that they seemed to have a lot of implications for validating the idea of reincarnation, but being a researcher, what he mostly was doing was just doing the scientific work and putting out the data and saying, well, that's the easiest explanation, but if you've got another one, I'd love to hear it, because I'm a scientist above all. And then he ended up publishing 250 cases that involved children with birthmarks or birth defects, which ended up being characteristics which matched wounds suffered by the previous individual they claimed to have been. In one case, for example, a child was talking about having been a teacher and in a town that he described, that he had been killed by somebody coming up behind him and shooting him in the head. And there was enough specificity to all of that that he felt, well, I ought to be able to find out whether that's true. There are autopsy records, things like this. And the child had a birthmark that was kind of blotchy on his forehead. And he found that, in fact, there were autopsy photos of a person by that name with that occupation that had died in that way. Moreover, there were autopsy photos of the entry and exit wounds. The entry wound was in the back, a small round entry wound, which in fact was a small round birthmark on the child under his hair. And in the front was the exit wound where part of his head was blown out. But there were 250 cases like this that he was able to demonstrate or corroborate with compelling evidence, and he published those as well. So the latter cases were published in, the 250 cases were in a 2,268-page, 2-volume work, including photos and reports, and they were very compelling. And that work continues to be done by his associate, Jim Tucker. Okay, again, difficult to explain if all we are is just this, because these other people typically were not related genetically, they weren't related in any way, typically in these cases, and they were in other locations, etc. So they seem to imply that somehow people do survive death, and that maybe they are spiritual beings having a human experience. Brian Weiss, some or all of you may have heard of. Weiss came from Columbia and Yale Medical School and became chairman emeritus at the Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami, Florida. Wrote 6 books. He's a renowned lecturer. He's been on the Oprah show at least twice for his work. And you may know that he did work on past life regression. Well, it was common in the hypnotherapy to attempt to go back through people's lives, their current life into their childhood and things like that, and attempt to find sources of current emotional and psychological issues. And he was doing that when one day he asked a question to which the subject, who was under hypnosis, gave him a really funny answer. And as he investigated further with the questions, it became apparent that she was giving him an answer from what appeared to be another experience, not this one. Because she'd misunderstood his question under hypnosis. And he found that he could, in fact, get all kinds of specific information. And finally, in one case, he actually found that in his regressions and getting lots and lots of data of a lot of patients who could actually talk about prior experiences in detail, he found that in one case, 2 of his clients were describing the same event in which they had been 2 different people having the same experience. That was about 2,000 years ago. And there was so much corroboration as to what happened. One of them had been a father who had been killed by some Roman soldiers, I believe, and the other had been the daughter who'd been there witnessing the whole thing and traumatized by it. And but they were both describing the same specific event, apparently. So anyway, over his 35-year career to date, he'd done more than 4,000 regressions, and found that an awareness of past life traumas often resulted in patient healings, physical healings, that appeared to have their sources in emotional and psychological problems that weren't from the current experience. It's now a widely known phenomenon. He's trained many other hypnotherapists, and actually I came to know one of his students who was doing hypnotherapy early on. And it was an interesting situation because he had a coworker that he had decided to do a regression on, and he did a regression on her, and she described a past life experience in which she'd been a desert Native American, desert Indian, so to speak, when he was bringing her back to the present, he brought her back, but he was kind of a neophyte at this, and when he brought her back, all of a sudden she smelled horrible, just a real pit. And in addition, and she couldn't stand herself. She said, "Oh, geez, what's going on with me here?" And she had to go to the ladies' room and wash herself off with paper towels and stuff because she was so smelly. And also, when he had brought her out, her vision was very poor, and she was very concerned about this because she couldn't see well. And when she came back after toweling him off, they realized that he hadn't really brought her back right, and so he brought her back to the time and did it right. And when she came back, she didn't have these issues. But it turned out that the issue that when she was under hypnosis, the reason why her vision was bad was because in that lifetime she had bad vision. And in this lifetime, she didn't have bad vision. So when he brought her back right, she didn't have any vision problem and she didn't smell horrible. And the smelliness was because she had been a desert Native American. They didn't have much water, so they weren't taking baths and stuff. They just did what they could, but they tended to smell like an animal. And, because they had no choice. So anyway, that was a very interesting situation. I know both of these people. I'm sure they weren't lying to me. We experienced a number of other phenomena that I knew for a fact were real. So anyway, it was some of a large body nowadays of this kind of information that I've come across. In my own case, I'm aware of a lot of past experiences going way back. And it appears to be evidence which is being corroborated not only by Brian Weiss, but by a whole host of people that he's trained in this area. There are others that have discovered even independently the same kind of thing. Michael Newton, you may know some of his books. He's a hypnotherapist also. One of the things that he found when he was doing hypnotherapy was that you could bring them back into the time between lives, and you could start asking them what they were doing then. And there was very, very interesting information that came out of that. And seemed to be corroborated between different people as to what kind of things they did between lives and how that all worked, and even technologies that they described, which were part and parcel of their apparent decision-making, which they also described, of having decided to come into a specific situation with specific parents, etc. Anyway, fascinating area. Also tended to imply that, in fact, people are spiritual beings having a human experience. Rupert Sheldrake is another example I want to give you here. Sheldrake was educated at Cambridge and Harvard and became a fellow of the Royal Society, educated in natural sciences and biochemistry, and a physiologist, became a scholar in residence at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and has been doing projects funded by the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is founded by the astronaut Edgar Mitchell, and has a host of really credible scientists associated with it. He's a visiting professor nowadays at the Graduate Institute, which is when I met him and heard him lecture. He's the author of more than 80 scientific papers and 10 books, and a guest lecturer in more than 30 colleges and universities around the world. One of the phenomena that Sheldrake started hearing about was dog owners that would claim that their dogs knew when they were coming home. And there was one particular woman named Pamela Smart that whose dog seemed to be a really good example of this from her description. And so he decided as a scientist to really undertake a study of this scientifically to find out whether this was a lot of hokum or just coincidence or whether there was really something to this. And so Pamela Smart and her dog agreed to participate, her dog cooperated. They did more than 100 time-coded videotaped experiments where they had video camera on the dog and at the same time on her, and they would take her out the door and at least 4 miles away, sometimes a lot more, and she'd be riding with somebody, and somebody who was with her would tell her, okay, go home now. So, you know, she didn't have any standard pattern or anything in this experiment. They would tell her, go home. And they could tell from the coding of the time of the video camera on her and the one watching the dogs, what the dog was doing at that particular time. Well, they found the bottom line of the experiments was, as I said, they did over 100 videotaped experiments. The dog was at the window 4% of the time when the owner wasn't returning, just went to the window and looked out. The dog was at the window 55% of the time when the owner was returning. And the odds, when you compute this mathematically, the odds of that being chance are more than 10,000 to 1 odds that it is not chance. And there are very few facts that we can point to in our lives that have greater odds of being proven than that. And then then there was an independent study of the same situation in which he was not involved, where they did their own thing, and they observed a similar pattern. So he concluded that the dog had somehow been telepathically influenced by the owner. Well, whatever the mechanism was, it certainly wasn't classical physics, that's for sure. Because if it was electromagnetic or brainwaves or things like that, all of the classical fields decrease in strength by exponentials from the source. So, you know, some of them are the inverse square law, so to speak, such as light. You know, it gets weaker by the square of the distance away. So, you know, by the time you get a real, you know, far distance, I mean, it's insignificant. As you know, I mean, if you got a light bulb and you go 100 miles away, nobody's able to perceive the light bulb anymore. But apparently, this influence didn't obey the inverse exponentials. It wasn't getting weaker if the person was next door, or the person was 5 miles away or 20 miles away or whatever. So again, it violated the classical physics, because according to classical physics, there is no influence that you can possibly have out of the only 5 fields that are recognized that is not decreasing with distance. Remote viewing also had nothing to do with distance. Sheldrake also heard about an African gray parrot exhibiting a mental or apparently telepathic phenomenon, and he decided this one was so unusual he would investigate this one as well. The African gray parrot was owned by somebody named Amy Morgana, and Amy felt that this parrot was able to read her thoughts. And she described a number of instances which she had where it sure seemed like it. So he decided to investigate this scientifically. And the pet named Nakisi has a vocabulary of about 800 words. And African grays are known for being very, very smart, and you can teach them to talk pretty well. So anyway, not only could this parrot have a vocabulary of 800 words, but the parrot could actually couple words into small sentences and express itself, apparently. So anyway, he studied all this, and the bird was shown to react telepathically to the owner's thoughts from a separate soundproof room. He put a video camera on Amy, put a video camera on the bird in a remote room. Both of them soundproof. The owner was given sealed envelopes that she would look at a photograph. She'd take out a picture and she'd look at it for 2 minutes. Excuse me. And the photographs were chosen by a third party who just looked at the vocabulary and said, well, you know, it's not going to be able to express itself if there isn't something related to some words in here. So they picked photographs that could conceivably be be commented on in some way. And so they did this at random. She would take out a picture, look at it for 2 minutes, and then and they were all randomized in advance. The parrot would then comment on them contemporaneously. Both of them were being continuously recorded on closed-circuit TV. And they used 3 independent subscribers so that there would be no question that people were agreeing on what the parrot was saying. 3 transcribers that were independent who would listen to what the parrot said independently and write down, okay, the parrot said this. And if they didn't have at least 2 of them agreeing on specifically what the parrot said, they'd throw it out as not proving anything. And so there were 149 2-minute trials. And the hits expected by chance of any of these words applying to any of these pictures were 12 out of 149. Nikisi said corresponding keywords in 23 trials. The odds mathematically of that happening are 5,000 to 1 odds against a chance result. Again, it sure appears that Nikisi could do this. And as a matter of fact, one of the things which piqued his interest originally was the owner said, that she would, and he didn't try to investigate this because it was not really something investigatable, but she said when she first started to realize what was happening here, she'd dream at night, and when she'd first wake up, she'd still remember what her dream was, and the parrot would be commenting on it. Oh, what a pretty flower! Red flower! Whatever it is. This prompted his whole investigation, but anyway, it appears to show that, in fact, thoughts can be communicated telepathically, and in fact, they're not limited to people. Again, I resonate with this myself because I have a dog that I am absolutely certain, and the dog before that is in fact reading my thoughts, and lots of evidence of it that's not scientific. It's just I experience it, but I've never made a study of it. But because I'd had this happen lots and lots of times, way against the odds of probability, it's credible to me that in fact it's true. And I think there are a lot of pet owners that probably could tell you that. With certain pets. Not that all pets do that, but I've seen it a lot. Not only with my pets, but some of my friends' pets that I would communicate with, and they would respond. But another case which was breaking all of the rules, Benoit Mandelbrot passed on recently, but gave some TED Talks not too long ago. He was originally got his PhD in mathematics from the University of Paris, and was on the staff of the National Scientific Research Center, Centre de la Recherche Scientifique. He was a fellow emeritus at the IBM Thomas J. Watson Research Center. He was a visiting professor of math at Harvard and Sterling professor of math sciences at Yale, where he was when he passed on. He was a Battelle Fellow, and he was made an officer in the French Legion of Honor for his work. He was awarded 21 major awards and prizes, and he had a small planet named after him called Mandelbrot in his honor. So, I mean, this guy is got credentials as long as you're on, as do these other people. And he wrote a book called The Fractal Geometry of Nature, and he's considered the father of fractal geometry, even though there are others who have observed the same thing. Mandelbrot really popularized it and brought it to the point of proof, wide-scale proof. His work was on the mathematics of roughness. Well, you talk about a boring topic. I mean, like a piece of sandpaper. What are the mathematics of its roughness? It's a pretty dull topic, but then, he extended it to everything, like the surface of the earth and mountains and, all of this kind of stuff. And he discovered that it was possible to, in a given case, to write a mathematical expression which could take one geometry and turn it into something that everybody thought was completely random, like a mountain or a cloud, or whatever. And he found that lakeshore contours could be characterized, by their roughness, and you could come up with mathematical expressions where all of the contours of the lake could be expressed by a single mathematical formula of a repetition of one geometry. And, it was astonishing because, classical science has said, everything is random, it's happenstance, all of this. What he proved actually was there's nothing that's random or happenstance. Everything has order. It's just we've been too ignorant to recognize how to analyze and express the order. But it is now known that order is everywhere. And even stock trading graphs, it turns out, the performance of the stock market. You could take a single geometry and a single mathematical expression, and you could show what the whole graph was. You could reproduce the entire graph from one geometry being repeated according to a particular mathematical expression. And the mathematical expression that was his discovery to originally discovered this phenomenon was called the Mandelbrot set. It is now called the Mandelbrot set. And it looks like kind of a funny geometry. But when you take that geometry and you plug it into this rather simple equation, understood properly mathematically, you could, in fact, reproduce something that, for that particular expression, would reproduce exactly something that was supposed to be totally random, like a mountain or a cloud or whatever. So, interestingly, after he made this discovery, and other mathematicians confirmed it and all of this, in 1991, this crop circle appeared in Cambridge, England, which is the Mandelbrot set. Another case I want to point you to of somebody that's proven some amazing things that have implications that, again, classical science and physics couldn't possibly explain, the fact that there's order everywhere. But these discoveries are showing that there is. Hans Jenny, who was a Swiss doctor, who was an MD, had 30 years of practice, and was taught at the Rudolf Steiner School in Zurich. He was sort of a Renaissance man. He was a doctor, fine artist, pianist, philosopher, historian, physical scientist, and researcher. He wrote 4 books, and he's considered the father of cymatics, a science called cymatics. Well, these are photographs of different cases that he demonstrated, and there, he had a whole library full of these kind of cases, where in one case, for example, he would use mushroom spores, or really fine dust of mushroom spores, and he put it on a sheet or a diaphragm, and then he'd expose it to sound, and the sheet would vibrate. And depending upon the frequency, he could change and get all kinds of different geometries that just suddenly appeared. Out of nowhere. He wasn't doing anything but exposing it to a sound frequency. And, here's an example here. All of a sudden, the particles would self-organize in some amazing geometry. And he found that not only could they be 2D, they could be 3D geometries that he could produce just by varying frequencies. And this one, I believe, was derived from powder. This one was a fluid, different fluid, glycerin. And he put a frequency into it. And all of a sudden, you see this absolutely intricate shape occur on the surface of the glycerin, and it's sustained as long as you sustain the frequency. Looks like a vertebrae from an animal. Then, here was another one where different fluid, and it looks like an ear, just coming up out of the fluid and holding itself there as long as you put the frequency in. And this wasn't a splash or this. These were sustained as long as you maintain the frequency. And what this actually is a circulation. The fluid is circulating up through here and down and sustaining and maintaining this geometry, which looks like an ear. But all of a sudden you could see some little clues about how nature actually forms complex things, via frequencies. And, it was really astounding. And, he did lots of work on this area, and it's just really compelling. Again, classical science couldn't possibly have predicted that. Well, this last one that I'm going to mention to you isn't proof of anything, but I wanted to mention him. Larry Dossey, whom I met when I was on the dais at Institute in Western New York, where people come and they're invited scientists from around the world are invited to give talks, and people come and they spend weeks there and everything. And Dossey was on the dais the same time that I was, and we and some others made presentations in that particular case. He's an amazing guy. I got to know him some from several presentations he did and I did, and I got to visit with him. This guy's the real McCoy. He graduated with honors from the University of Texas. He's an MD from Southwestern Medical School. He eventually became chief of staff at the Medical City Dallas Hospital, which is a major hospital in Dallas. And he was, before that, in Vietnam, a battalion surgeon decorated for valor. Author of 9 books, has lectured all over the world, including Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Cornell, universities of Pennsylvania, California, Washington, Texas, Florida, Minnesota, and the Mayo Clinic. He's a recipient of 3 prestigious awards. Amazing guy. His latest book is called One Mind, and I can recommend it to you. While it isn't about proofs, it's about experiences which he and others, many others, mostly other people, but some of his too, have had of phenomena that again defy the classical view of what's possible. And what happens, one of the reasons I'm doing this lecture is because there's a tendency, once people open themselves to understanding how things really work, what you tend to find is more and more synchronicity in your own life. Amazing things happening, and more amazing things happening as you start to awaken to the fact that these truths are possible. And that's what his book is about. It's about people having these amazing experiences, which he has, which was causing him to conclude that, in fact, at the highest level, there's a single mind. Well, that's actually consistent with the phenomenon of remote viewing and a number of other phenomena. So, anyway, there's compelling scientific evidence that supports the metaphysical hypotheses that we're spiritual beings having a human experience, and that there's demonstrable universal order and omniscience.